Today on Living History, we're speaking with James Zimmerman.
China only had, very, very rudimentary contract law to the credit of the Chinese. They accepted well over half of the suggestions and recommendations. And it was like, wow, we're actually assisting in the law drafting process. They're listening to us. You would never have, the U.S. Congress and that would turn to the Chinese lawyers and say, help us draft the law.
Today we're speaking with James Zimmerman, who for more than 26 years has been the go-to lawyer in Beijing, both for foreign companies and individuals in need of miracles large and small. He's represented a wide range of businesses from around the world and worked with Chinese regulators in drafting laws for those businesses. And he's also the four-time chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. And James is the author of the acclaimed book, The Peking Express, The Bandits Who Stole a Train, Stunned the West and Broke the Republic of China. About his many stories and memories and secrets, we're very happy to chat today. James Zimmerman, welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be part of this project and be part of history, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My first question to you is, why does a successful American attorney decide to come to China in 1998?
Well, it was a little bit of background. Was as a master's student in the early 1980s, China was somewhat on the map. Things have opened up in the late 70s. In the late 80s, there was a strong interest in driving American business, foreign business to the mainland China. I was a master's student in the early 80s and did my thesis on Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations. It was a very simple pronouncement of how China was going to develop its education system, technology, and military and so forth. And it was a way to really drive China forward. And a big component of that was developing a legal system, developing a judicial system, because quite frankly, during the Cultural Revolution, the legal system was almost completely disbanded. So they were, for the most part, starting from scratch. So as a master's student, I was very curious about working and supporting the development of the law in China. And that was something I studied through law school. But I became a lawyer in 1988. In fact, the day I was sworn in at the federal U.S. court was January 8th, 1988. And so that was quite an auspicious day just to start the whole career. And then, but then shortly after that in '89, we had Tiananmen, which affected, the thinking of most foreign business, of governments as to whether they really truly wanted, to support, China's development and rise. And so that slowed things down. And as a young lawyer, I was still very much interested in China and Asia. I made my first trip on behalf of clients in 1992 and could see, the development, the excitement, the enthusiasm of the Chinese people in welcoming business. But they had a long ways to go. From 92 onwards, we were looking at, rewriting all of their laws. I eventually moved with my family in 1998 and opened the office of a firm, a San Francisco-based law firm. It was very, very small. I was pretty much the only lawyer there. And then started getting involved, with the American Chamber of Commerce and U.S.-China Business Council and other organizations, and quickly realized how the Chinese were really excited to request the assistance and participation of foreign lawyers. So that was, it was a door that opened for us to be part of that process and to develop the laws, because we knew that as China continued on a path of development, a legal system was very, very important. It was important because it provided the certainty and the stability that foreign companies needed in order to operate. And that not only involved drafting laws, but it also involved the development of the institutions. the regulatory environment, the government agencies, the administrative agencies, and the prosecutors that were required to interpret and to enforce the laws. So it was a huge, huge undertaking. So from the time I moved in 98 and even up to this day, we saw a law drafting process that is nonstop. And one of my biggest projects that I did for the American Bar Association was the authorship of what is called the China Law Desk Book. The first edition came out in 1998, and it was relatively thin. Yeah, because there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. We talked about, joint venture laws and some of the basic contract laws that were applicable only to foreigners. But by the time the fourth edition of the China Law Desk Book came out in 2015, it had expanded to over 2 volumes. And so the law process, drafting process continued to grow, and I was part of that. And I do remember when I first arrived in 1998, one of the projects was to assist in the drafting of the contract law. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but before that time, China only had, very, very rudimentary contract law. They actually had 2 laws. One was for domestic Chinese contracts, and the other was for foreign contracts. And the treatment of each was very different. So they tried to merge the law into one law. And that process took several years of going back and forth with draft laws and suggestions, and not just suggestions from American law, but laws from around the world, like German law. The EU was also very active in the law drafting process. And to the credit of the Chinese, they accepted well over half of the suggestions and recommendations, by the American lawyers at AmCham that were participating in that process. And it was like, wow, we're actually assisting in the law drafting process. They're listening to us. You would never have, the U.S. Congress that would turn to the Chinese lawyers and say, help us draft the law. But it was here a situation where the Legislative Affairs Office for the MPC was actually going to foreign lawyers requesting assistance. So this was back in 1998, and that day forward, we were called in to support the law drafting in a lot of ways, labor contract law, the anti-monopoly law, and a whole host of laws and regulations we actually participated in. And that was a very unique experience. So, and again, I give the Chinese side a lot of credit in seeking the input from a lot various sources, not just their own lawyers, but also lawyers from around the world. On top of that, the energy level back in 1998 and all the way through the mid-2000s, you saw, hundreds and hundreds of Chinese lawyers going to the U.S. and studying at American law schools. They still, you see many still going to the U.S. and other parts of the world to, develop their skill sets. But back then, it was a key requirement almost, and it was very important. So, and in my view, that helped, China's development because they had a comparative view. They not only studied their own laws, but they looked at, and studied the laws of other countries. So they were able to have, that comparative view so that they could look at how other countries develop their laws, apply their laws, implement their laws. And it just made them better lawyers. That was something that we as lawyers, foreign lawyers here operating in China, were, very, very, excited about. The amount of involvement that foreign lawyers had with the development of the legal system is something that, we're all very proud of, that I'm very proud of. And the legacy of China's legal system really has part of its roots, not just in what the people were doing here, but also, with the support from the foreign bars, foreign legal system, from around the world, just not the American lawyers, but also lawyers from Canada, Europe, and so forth.
How long did it take until there was a deep bench of really good Chinese lawyers? Was it immediately 95, 92 or something, or did it happen later?
No, I believe right up from the beginning, there was always a really good number of lawyers. The older generation may have been, have been raised during the Cultural Revolution. They had other experiences with how the law was either ignored or was applied differently under different circumstances. So from the get-go, there was a lot of good lawyers, even, back, in the early 90s. Of course, over time, when they get that comparative view, that it just strengthens their analytical skills, their abilities. So, but I wouldn't say, there was a specific time when I felt that the skill sets were at a point that would be equal to, the U.S. law firms or, global lawyers. But, the quality hasn't been improving, and, it's remarkable. And in a way that all of us, and even including the foreign lawyers, are very proud of.
You were involved with a lot of early joint ventures here in China. And we had heard other people say that often between the foreigners and the Chinese side, it was the first time they cooperated. There were misunderstandings, misaligned priorities. What was it like for you? What were the cases that you were working on?
Well, it was more of a restriction because a lot of foreign companies wanted to do things their own. And then until the Holy Foreign-Owned Enterprise law was really utilized in a way that people could operate, independently, we had to work with the joint venture laws. And, we had, equity joint ventures and contractual joint ventures. But unfortunately, some of these, the rules were, restrictive or in a way that they protected the Chinese partner. But it was an education process for the foreigners because, oftentimes for the first time they had a local partner that they had to work with, and they could not operate like they do, at home or in other countries where they have full autonomy. They had to work with a partner, and oftentimes the partner was either a state-owned enterprise or was effectively a government agency. And there was things that they had to understand and appreciate about, working with those partners that was very, very, very different from, working with a private enterprise in, say, the U.S. So there was a learning curve that even the foreign companies had to understand and to appreciate when they were negotiating and when they finally started implementing and operating joint ventures here.
Give me an example for one of those cases where you were able to help.
Well, I mean, it's one example would be, when we're sitting down to negotiate, the foreign side wants efficiency in the operations and can't understand why the joint venture partner wants 20 drivers, and on the U.S. side is, do we need them? We see the drivers basically sitting around all day and waiting to work, and all they're doing is smoking. And so some of the foreigners had to, set aside their expectations and the way they do business in other parts of the world and understand that employment was a real key issue. Efficiency, sure, that was important, but they also had to understand that there was very much an emphasis to keep people employed. And the joint venture partners, what they brought to the table, they wanted to make sure that employment was met. I mean, there's a lot of other examples too, is like on financing issues or land use issues. The foreign, joint ventures, the foreign companies, they had certain expectations, and they had certain ways of doing things, and they didn't understand why they had to constantly, seek the opinions of the Chinese side and then wait until they responded. They were very much used to making quick decisions. So there's a lot of examples of the ways that foreign companies were just not prepared for, working with a Chinese company, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, and trying to understand the politics, and then the culture of working with their Chinese partners.
Those were also the years when China somewhat earned a reputation for a dicey place in terms of intellectual property and trademarks, and basically was that China rips off. What were your experiences in that, and is it even true?
Well, it was a learning curve on both sides. The Chinese side needed to understand and respect intellectual property as well. But I think most foreign companies that ran into trouble with that did not protect themselves enough and did not protect their core technologies enough. And either the Chinese party, utilized it in a way that was inappropriate, or there was not the contractual protections, the technical controls were just not there. So there was a lot of mistakes on the U.S. side or the foreign side because they just assumed, that the Chinese side would respect their technology. But and the Chinese side was saying, you bring your technology, of course we're going to use it. We're going to use it in many, many ways. So I think there was some misunderstandings on both sides. In time, though, and you see more and more Chinese companies, and this has been the case for at least over a decade or more, that they do respect IP because they themselves have their own R&D. They themselves are developing their own technology, and they realize that there's value to that. There's an investment that they've made, and they want to have that protected just as much as the technology that they may be licensed from a foreign party. So it's been a learning curve on both sides on how best to utilize and respect the intellectual property of either side. I mean, I would say that almost every case in every matter I've had, that politics trumps the law. Politics trumps the contracts. Politics is everything, and in the culture is everything, and those need to be understood more so than the written contract. And many, situations in one where there was a clear breach, on the Chinese party's side. But the Chinese, in order to resolve the dispute, and they admitted that their liability, but what they really wanted was the foreign party to apologize. And that apology was needed internally. A written apology was needed, even though they were the party that had breached the contract, and it was a money issue. Is they said, sure, we owe you money, but you promised us a long-term relationship, but the foreign party says we don't want to have a long-term relationship now with you because you haven't paid us. But at the end of the day, the Chinese side said, yes, we'll pay you every penny, but you need to apologize to us. And why? That there was some very informal, commitment made for a longer, more deeper relationship. But the foreign party side was not willing to do that until, the Chinese side followed through, and specifically with paying its obligations. So that was an interesting thing, because if that in a U.S. court, it would be a breach of contract, damages would be awarded, and that would be the end of it. But here, I would never forget, in that one specific situation, I was up all night negotiating an apology letter that wasn't really an apology letter. And it was a letter of regret. And we had to do that in order to get our money.
Apologies and admissions of guilt are treated very differently here, right? In English, if we say, oh, you're wrong about this, that's a very normal thing to say in a meeting. But in Chinese, to say 你错的 is very, very, a very strong, a very different feeling. What is your advice for people wanting to navigate these cultural differences?
I mean, in any discussions, the culture, the politics, again, are critically important. and will override and trump any written contract or any law, and you have to be aware of the cultural and political sensitivities. You have to be aware that, there's other people, other interests involved, not just the joint venture partner, but you have to be concerned about, the ultimate owners and ultimate government agencies that are supervising this, Chinese party. You need to be aware of, the concerns that they have. And for a while, too, a lot of the motivations of the state-owned enterprises was employment. And now things have changed to a certain degree. Employment's important, but there's other considerations state-owned enterprises will have that go beyond just the basic terms of the contract. So we try to emphasize that, yes, you do have a contract. You can stick to the contract, but the Chinese party is going to look to flexibility. They're going to look to mutual understanding, mutuality. And those concepts are very hard to define, and very hard to implement, especially after you have a contract that says what it clearly says. But it's not, contracts were made to be, reinterpreted or massaged in their interpretation. And why? Because there's other cultural and political issues that need to be taken into consideration.
Something else that you became very famous for is that you helped individuals who got into trouble in China, specifically with national security laws, and you earned a reputation for being the gentleman who makes miracles happen for people in hopeless situations. How did that come to be?
Things started to change. Going backing up under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, the leadership was very much interested in making the laws and the legal system much more independent from the political system. There was talk about the courts becoming much more independent. There was talk about the bar becoming more independent from the political system. In 2012, though, things changed. Xi Jinping came into power, and his emphasis was more on managing, if not guiding, if not controlling the legal system. And that included the lawyers. The lawyers themselves, after 2012, were required to give a loyalty oath to the party. Now, that's something you don't see in Western legal systems. As an American lawyer, my obligation is to uphold, the Constitution and the laws of the U.S., but I am not, required to give a loyalty oath to the Republican Party, Democratic Party, Libertarians, Greens, or whoever. I don't have to do that. But here, the Chinese lawyers are required to give a loyalty oath to the party, and that started under Xi Jinping in 2012. The talk before then about greater independence of the law died down. It was even Hu Jintao himself at one of the party's congresses. He used the word democracy like 65 times. Now, what he was talking about was intra-party democracy. But that discussion has died. That's something in the past. So from 2012 on, there was very similar to what you see in the U.S., like China first argument, like an American first argument, and national security was so important, and so what we're seeing today is more of an emphasis on national security. We see government agencies like CCDI and CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, not being truly government agencies, but being party departments, and driving the messages and so forth. So you see this huge emphasis on national security, which has resulted in many cases being initiated against foreigners for perceived national security violations. And unfortunately, these kinds of cases are, I guess, outside of the processes of the legal system, where investigations can go on and on and on, for years. Where the typical run-of-the-mill crime, you have processes that require that the prosecutors formally arrest a suspect, that they proceed with the charges and indictment, move forward with trial, but not with national security. So we've been seeing an uptick in the number of foreigners that have been subject to investigations. And that's something that just as the natural evolution of the legal system in China, we're seeing more of. Now, the other thing we see is more just general investigations by the government. Some of that is to be expected. Back in 1992, 98, you had laws, but you didn't have processes. You didn't have the institutions. One example is with the anti-monopoly law. That didn't really exist. You had an unfair competition law, but you didn't have a government agency that was going to pursue, antitrust issues. Over time, they built up the institutions. And now they have a full departments that have the tools and the processes to initiate investigations. So we see more investigations in a wide range of areas, not just with anti-monopoly, but things like customs crimes, financial crimes. So now with more laws, with more government institutions, you're going to have more, investigations. And so that we see an uptick on, which is different from, of course, the national security investigations. But hand in hand, we are seeing more and more of that. Part of it, that's just a natural progression, of developing a legal system. You can't have crimes if you don't have laws. You can't have investigations unless you have the laws and the procedures. So they've come a long ways in developing the processes to investigate crimes in a lot of ways. And so we see that more and more today. But one of the things that causes some of the concerns, and this came directly from Chinese lawyers, is after 2012, and there's less emphasis on the legal system being independent, and more of an emphasis on the party managing and controlling the legal system. But Chinese lawyers, and one has said to me, keep in mind, the law serves the politics. And that is more of a word of caution than anything, but it does emphasize that, we have a system that may be subject to the political whims, of the party, and that, in some respects is kind of not what we wanted to see back, 30 years ago. It's not something we wanted to see when we were talking about developing the contract law. The law is supposed to be very objective. Not subjective, but objective. It has to be clear. It has to be certain. It has to be stable. But if the politics, overrides the law, if the law serves the politics, that puts everyone at risk, including the entire Chinese system. So we're in a very, I think, a very precarious situation today, and hopefully the legal system will go back to being, less managed and controlled by the party. We'll have to see how that plays out over time. But I think, what the leadership does not truly understand is that the more politics overrides the law, the less business wants to be here. Business needs certainty. Business needs stability. And if the politics overrides the law, that is not a stable system.
One of the things that I noticed is that every time, for instance, that foreigners would be politically detained in China, that the foreign politicians all were completely unprepared. and didn't know how to react. We saw this, for instance, with the cases of the Canadians who were taken when Chinese citizens were taken and arrested in Canada. And they thought, oh, we're just going to use our Western principle and let the courts do their thing. And the result was that the Canadian citizens spent more than 1,000 days in Chinese prisons. What was your advice, or what would your advice be for foreign politicians facing such situations? How should you deal with a system that is so different from what they are used to?
I mean, most foreign governments must take the position that, first, that, human beings should not be bargaining chips. I mean, secondly is that, and there must be an end to, hostage diplomacy, because, that's what happened in a lot of these situations. The law really didn't matter. And in all these cases, you would have a legal strategy, and that didn't matter. You'd have a political strategy, and it was all about the politics, and, with certain, foreign nationals that have been detained, many of those cases are driven by, it was almost like a tit for tat, where the perception was, you have detained my people, I'm going to detain your people. And unfortunately, that is not is not part of the legal system. It's because processes are basically serving the politics. All right, and with the Canadians, they were clearly detained not because of anything that they did wrong, but they were detained because of Canada's and the U.S. Moving forward with the extradition, of a Huawei employee, and the Chinese side felt that had crossed the line. And unfortunately, they're going those cases were purely nothing more than hostage diplomacy. For lawyers, those cases are troubling, very, very troubling, because the legal strategy, there is none. You can go through the motions of trying to defend someone in trial, but unfortunately, the prosecutions have managed the evidence and controlled the evidence to the point where a decision is inevitable. A conviction is inevitable. And that's something no lawyer can be prepared for. But at the same time, you have to go forward with the legal strategy. But at the same time, the political strategy is what ultimately will get somebody free.
Could those cases have been resolved quicker?
From the eyes of the Chinese side, yes, they felt that if, the executive from Huawei was released earlier, then the case would have been resolved much easier. And it was all about that. It was not about, any crime having been committed. And it was purely hostage diplomacy. And that is a situation in a number of cases that foreign governments need to stand up to that and emphasize that, human beings cannot be used as bargaining chips. Now, what I have emphasized, with my contacts within the Chinese government, is a red line for American business is if they do that, they've gotten away with that with, smaller countries like Canada or maybe Australia. But I mean, American business is keen to those kinds of things. And if they see that American executives are being detained for these kinds of, as a bargaining chips for broader issues, that's a red line, that if they cross, business is going to walk. And that's something that is a big concern. And they need to understand that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I think the Chinese side understands that. and they have to avoid really pushing that envelope, because that really, truly is a deal breaker.
What was the understanding of China, the knowledge about China among foreign politicians? You have pictures of Joe Biden there next to you in the 1990s or 2000s.
You go back 3-4 decades, there are certain politicians that understand the importance of, keeping your enemies closer. Today, I don't think they get that. All right. That's something that is going to impact the U.S., if they don't understand that principle. I think Nixon got it. I think Kissinger got it. Keeping your friends close and enemies closer is another way of saying engagement in a certain level. When you have a policy of, calling the Chinese adversaries, that is going to have a reverse effect. And that's something that we've recently seen with the second Trump administration. With the Biden administration, they referred to China as competitors. But if you push your competitors, your adversaries, your enemies away, you're missing an opportunity, all right? Because keep in mind, your adversary might be the party, which is only 7% of the people. But what about the other 93%? All right, what about the bulk of the country that really enjoy traveling to the U.S. or are infatuated with American goods and services, or European goods and services? So the 93%, we really need to keep close to us. Those are our friends. But at the same time, the 7%, the party, the leaders, we need to keep them close as well. And a failure to do that is going to be a lost opportunity for American business. And that's something that politicians just don't get.
So then, did Joe Biden understand China?
I would say that Joe Biden himself may have understood China, but I don't think his team and that may be because the pressure that his team was under, if they really understood the long game, in China. And then, and it was a surprise because when Biden, came into office, there in 2021, there was a sense of hope that they would get back on track in the way that the Obama administration had been engaged with China, and that did not come to pass. Those driving the China policy, including the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State under Biden, were very aggressive in a thinking that could easily be one of decoupling. And the business community was shocked by that. So I feel Biden himself understood China, but his team is a different story.
How does that compare to the mood among American politicians in the early 2000s and the late 1990s when you were involved?
Oh, it was, vastly different. The number of delegations that had come over, all through the Obama years, up through the end of 2016, was substantial. Keep in mind, in 2016, the Obama administration was negotiating the bilateral investment treaty, which would have supported American business in multiple ways here. The U.S. was negotiating TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and China wanted to be part of that. China made it very clear that TPP was incomplete, without China. And they were willing to make changes to reform in order to be part of TPP. All right. In addition, the Obama administration had negotiated a cybersecurity agreement. So there was less hacking, more, more of a détente with issues concerning, cybersecurity issues. All that ended at the end of 2016 when Trump's first term. All of that ended. But to answer your question, the amount of engagement, from the time I moved here in 98 and all through 2016 was substantial, So, I mean, the number of CEOs that would come over was, you name it, And so the so-called golden years in that time, every major corporation, every, medium-sized and even small companies could see the opportunities here and were tapping the opportunities, and they were profitable. And a lot of them remain profitable today. But if the political will is not there, and there's sanctions, there's tariffs, there's, general, the tension in the relationship, it's not a good environment for American companies. And it's issues on both sides. It's not just, the U.S. and its attitude towards China, but there's certain things that the Chinese could be doing differently as well.
Well, then tell me about that. How do we get back to better relations?
I think it's going to be very, very challenging to return to the 2016 or before years where there was engagement. But I think you're going to have to see some progress on the Chinese side. I think you're going to have to see some more stability in the regional relationship with the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Philippines, neighbors like Vietnam and India. And then also you need a de-emphasis away from Russia. So China's relationship with Russia is causing a lot of heartburn in Washington, and that's something that, and it also in Europe as well, so that is a concern, and China needs to, realize, and I don't think Xi Jinping understands that Beijing's relationship with Moscow is a big, big concern. So there's going to have to be some toning down of that. On the business side, again, we want, stability and certainty of the laws. We need to make sure that the legal system, is depoliticized as much as possible and is independent if we can. But you're talking about a major change in just the way of thinking, and we'll have to see what happens. But I'm not completely optimistic unless we see some bold, changes on both sides. But as under the first Trump administration, where he was blaming China for COVID, and imposing tariffs, it was a very tense environment. And unfortunately, we'll probably be seeing more of the same. Of course, Trump wants a deal with Xi, but whatever that deal is, it's probably going to be nothing more than what we saw under the Phase 1 agreement. But what we really need is true engagement on multiple levels, because right now we're not. There's very little engagement, and that was something under both, the first Trump as well as the Biden administration. The USTR under the Biden administration never stepped foot here in China, as I understand it. So, her job is to negotiate trade agreements on behalf of the United States government. It's hard to do that if you don't show up.
James, I wanna change topic a little bit. You have also revealed yourself as a very wise writer. Namely, you wrote a story in the Peking Express about a time in China that was dominated by warlords, where travel between cities like Shanghai and Beijing was dangerous, which directly led to the Chinese Civil War, the revolution, and the China that we are living in today. How did you get interested in that topic?
I've always, since I've been involved with China, and even in the early '80s, I was fascinated by the foreigners that came to China. And basically, they were pioneers. Some were missionaries. But all were trying to commercialize the opportunities. And so in the early 20th century, you had a lot of foreigners here from pretty much, around the world. And they lived in interesting times, just as we're living in interesting times today. And there are a lot of parallels. There are a lot of parallels what had happened back then and today. The Peking Express story is just another form of hostage diplomacy, as we see today. And that was one of the things that fascinated me in chasing the story, chasing the families that were impacted in some way. So, but I'm actually working on a number of books that involve foreigners and the issues that they've had, in China in the early 20th century. But it's a fascinating time frame for me. And then you do see parallels. You see a lot of parallels with what transpired, in the 20s and 30s and 40s with what you see today. So those parallels, that comparative, viewpoint is interesting, not just as a historian, but as somebody, that is a writer, a lawyer that operates in China today. So, but I'll continue to write and continue to bring forth stories that I think will interest people. I mean, because the Peking Express is China's great train robbery, and it had a big impact. It had an impact on the people that were affected, but it had an impact on China and China's history and where it is today.
Are there things here you feel you cannot do based on you being a foreigner?
No, I don't. I never felt like I could do that. I can't do anything. Well, let me give you an example of, something I found very fascinating. I had my daughter visiting, my 31-year-old daughter visiting here with her husband. And so we went to a lot of tourist areas, the Temple of Heaven, the Great Wall, the Forbidden City, and a lot of these places I hadn't been to in a while, but when going to all of these places, the first questions the ticket booth would ask is, how old are you? And I'm like, well, okay. So I show my passport and they say, you get in free because you're a senior citizen. And I'm like, wow. That is a privilege and an honor to be a senior here in China, and they honored that. Compare that with the US, yeah, we get senior discounts, but it's really wonderful that they treat the seniors and allow them to enter all these cultural sites for free. So that's something I was very, very fascinated about. But do I feel because I'm a foreigner I can't do everything? No, not really. I can do it pretty much everything I want, but the added advantage of being a senior citizen here is really wonderful.